At 11:47 p.m., the prison settled into the kind of silence that was never truly silent. Ventilation systems groaned behind concrete walls. Fluorescent lights hummed above empty corridors. A steel door slammed somewhere in the distance. Elias Voss was awake. He sat on the edge of his bunk, listening to footsteps approaching his unit. He had learned long ago that footsteps told you more than uniforms did. These footsteps belonged to someone who expected the world to move aside. Elias smiled before the door opened. Warden Mara Vale appeared beyond the bars. She was known throughout the prison for her discipline. She rarely raised her voice because she never needed to. A glance from Mara could end an argument before it began. Staff respected her. Inmates feared her. Administrators praised her efficiency. But Elias had discovered another version of her. That was what made their secret so dangerous. Their connection had started with conversations. Late meetings disguised as administrative business. Questions about his case became questions about his childhood and regrets. Mara had listened with an attention Elias had almost forgotten existed. He had responded in kind. Then boundaries disappeared. Tonight, however, something had changed. Mara entered quietly and locked the door behind her. She did not look like the woman who commanded an entire prison. Her shoulders were tense, and her usual confidence seemed thinner than usual. "You said you found something," she whispered. Elias looked at her. "I did." "What?" He did not answer. For several seconds, neither moved. The room seemed suddenly smaller, trapping two people who understood that whatever happened next could not be undone. Mara stepped closer. "Elias, tell me what you saw." There was fear in her voice. Real fear. He could hear his own heartbeat beneath the humming lights above them tonight. That surprised him more than the discovery itself. Until that moment, Elias had believed Mara was frightened of losing her position. He had assumed she feared scandal, exposure, perhaps even prison. But this was different. She wasn't afraid of what people might think. She was afraid of what he knew. Elias glanced toward the small table beside the bed. A folder rested there, unopened. He had found it earlier that evening in a place where it should never have been. He expected secrets. He had not expected a pattern. Names, dates, reports. One death everyone had called an accident. Another called suicide. And a signature that appeared where Elias believed it should never have existed. Mara watched his face carefully. "What did you find?" Elias finally laughed. It was quiet at first, almost involuntary. Then Mara's expression changed. "Why are you laughing?" He looked at her, and for the first time since their secret began, he felt something close to power. Not safety, not victory, power. Because the woman standing before him was no longer simply the warden. She was someone who had something to lose. Elias leaned back against the wall. "You spent all this time thinking you were controlling me." Mara's eyes hardened. "Don't make a mistake you can't take back." Elias smiled again. "I think that mistake was made a long time ago." Outside, another door slammed somewhere in the darkness. Neither of them moved. Then Elias lowered his voice. "Now I know what you're really afraid of." The words stayed between them long after Elias stopped speaking. "Now I know what you're really afraid of." Mara heard them again as she walked back through the prison corridors. But the sound of her own footsteps could not drown them out. For the first time in years, she felt something she hated more than anger. Uncertainty. To understand why those words frightened her so deeply, it was necessary to go back. Long before Elias Voss became a name she whispered in empty rooms, Mara Vale had built her life around control. She had grown up believing that people revealed their true nature when pressure became unbearable. Her father had called weakness an invitation. Her mother had called silence survival. Mara learned from both. She became the woman who never cried at work, never apologized unnecessarily, and never allowed anyone to see her hesitate. The prison suited her. Concrete walls made sense to her. Rules had consequences. Doors opened when they were supposed to and locked when they were supposed to. Unlike people, steel could be trusted. Her rise through the correction system was almost effortless. She learned which officers needed praise, which administrators needed reassurance, and which inmates needed to believe she was watching them even when she wasn't. Her marriage was different. At first, her husband admired her strength. Later, he resented it. Their conversations became arguments, their arguments became silence, and eventually silence became the only thing they shared. Mara stayed, not because she was happy, but because leaving felt like admitting failure. By the time the marriage finally collapsed, she had already perfected the art of pretending nothing was wrong. Then Elias appeared. He was not the loudest inmate or the most intimidating. In fact, that was part of what caught her attention. He listened. During an interview about a disciplinary violation, Elias answered her questions without begging for sympathy. When she expected anger, he offered sarcasm. When she expected fear, he gave her a calm smile. "You don't trust people," he told her once. Mara had stared at him. "You're an inmate. You don't know me. I know what you look like when you're pretending." She should have ended the conversation. Instead, she remembered it. Their meetings became longer. Questions about prison rules turned into conversations about loneliness. Elias spoke about mistakes he regretted without asking Mara to forgive him. Mara began telling him things she had never told coworkers. He made her feel understood. That feeling became dangerous. The first boundary crossed was almost invisible. A conversation that lasted too long. A private meeting that had no legitimate reason to continue. A moment when neither person stepped away. After that, excuses became easier. Mara convinced herself that Elias needed someone to listen. Elias allowed her to believe that. He understood that Mara wanted to be needed, not loved. So he gave her what she wanted. Patience, attention, and the illusion that she was the person who could reach him. But every conversation gave Elias something in return. He was collecting pieces of her. Neither understood how valuable pieces would become to Elias later on. What Mara failed to understand was that Elias was listening too. He noticed the names she avoided, the subjects that changed her expression, the questions that made her defensive. He studied her the way he studied everyone. And while Mara slowly became emotionally dependent on the attention he gave her, Elias remained strangely detached. She believed she was saving him. She never considered that he might be learning her. That mistake would eventually become the foundation of everything that followed. That mistake did not become obvious immediately. It began with small things. Elias received a schedule change that moved him away from a troublesome unit. A disciplinary report disappeared before it reached the review board. During one inspection, an officer suddenly decided not to search his cell after receiving a quiet instruction from Mara. None of it looked important by itself. Together, it formed a pattern. Mara told herself the favors were harmless. She called them corrections, administrative decisions, exceptions made because she understood Elias better than anyone else. But Elias understood exactly what they were. Protection. He never asked for much. That was deliberate. A request here, a question there. Sometimes he simply mentioned a problem and waited. Mara would solve it. That was how Elias measured her attachment. He discovered that the more he withdrew, the more she reached for him. If he became distant, she found a reason to speak with him. If he stopped answering questions, she became anxious. If another officer challenged him, Mara somehow learned about it before the complaint was even filed. Elias kept these details in his memory. He did not need paper. The prison itself became his notebook. He noticed which doors opened for him, which officers suddenly looked away, and which rules seemed to disappear whenever Mara was nearby. What he did not notice was that someone else was watching. Darren Cole had been inside the prison long enough to recognize favoritism before most people recognized the person receiving it. He was older than Elias, broad-shouldered, and quiet in a way that made younger inmates uncomfortable. Darren had spent years building relationships with inmates, guards, kitchen workers, and anyone else who could provide information. One afternoon, he sat beside Elias in the recreation yard. "You're getting special treatment." Elias did not look at him. "Maybe I'm finally charming." Darren gave a dry laugh. "That's not charm." Elias glanced over. "Then what is it?" "Debt." The word stayed there. Darren leaned closer. Powerful people don't give things away. They collect. Elias smiled. You sound worried. I sound experienced. For a moment, Elias said nothing. Darren studied him carefully. You think you're using her. I know I'm using her. That confidence is exactly what worries me. Elias turned toward him. You don't understand her. No, Darren said. I understand people who think they're smarter than the person holding the key. Elias laughed and walked away. He believed Darren had mistaken control for danger. In Elias's mind, Mara had already revealed her weakness. She needed him. She trusted him. More importantly, she feared losing the connection they had created. That made her predictable, or so he thought. What Elias did not see was Mara watching from an office window above the yard. Her eyes followed him until he disappeared through the next security door. She did not look angry. She looked frightened. Darren noticed. He remained in the yard, staring toward the window after Mara stepped away. That was when he understood something Elias had missed. The warden wasn't protecting Elias because she trusted him. She was protecting herself because she was afraid of what he knew. That evening, Darren found Elias alone near the showers. You need to listen to me. Elias continued walking. She isn't afraid of losing you, Darren said. Elias stopped. Darren lowered his voice. She is afraid you'll tell somebody. Elias slowly turned around. For the first time, his smile disappeared. He thought about the favors, the missing report, the private meetings, the questions Mara refused to answer. Then he remembered something else. A name she had once mentioned once before abruptly changing the subject. Elias looked toward the corridor where Mara's office stood beyond several locked doors. What name? He asked himself. He could not remember, but now he wanted to. And somewhere inside the prison's records room, an old file was waiting for him. The file waiting in the records room had been there for years. Elias did not know that yet. What he knew was that Darren's warning had changed the way he looked at everything. Every favor from Mara suddenly seemed connected to something larger. Every nervous glance carried a question. And that was why, later that night, when the prison settled into darkness, Elias returned to the records corridor. He had no permission to be there. He had never needed permission to become curious. The corridor smelled of dust, paper, and disinfectant. Old files filled metal cabinets beneath weak fluorescent lights. Elias moved slowly, listening for footsteps. Then he found the name. A former inmate named Caleb Rourke. The name meant nothing. Then Elias remembered the story. Rourke had died 18 months earlier. Officially, he had suffered a medical emergency inside his cell. The report described the death as sudden and unavoidable. But Elias remembered hearing different rumors. Rourke had complained about chest pain for days. He had requested medical attention. According to another inmate, he had been frightened before his death and repeatedly asked to speak with someone outside the prison. Elias pulled the file free. The first pages looked ordinary. Then he noticed something strange. Several pages had been removed. Not misplaced. Removed. He checked the authorization sheet. One signature appeared beside the missing material. Mara Vale. Elias stared at the name. For several seconds, he heard nothing except the buzzing lights. Then he remembered Mara's reaction whenever Elias asked about deaths inside the prison. She always became distant. He had assumed it was professional caution. Now he wondered whether it was fear. He turned another page and found a handwritten note attached to an internal report. Review access restricted by administration. No explanation. No reason. Only another signature. Mara's. Elias felt something cold settle inside his chest. He thought about Darren's words. She isn't afraid of losing you. She is afraid you'll tell somebody. Suddenly, the pieces began shifting. The favors. The altered schedules. The private meetings. The missing reports. And now this. Elias closed the file and carried it back toward his cell. But before he reached the corridor's end, he heard footsteps. He slipped the folder beneath his shirt. Mara appeared around the corner. She stopped when she saw him. For a moment, neither spoke. Her eyes moved toward the place where the folder was hidden. "You shouldn't be here," she said. Elias smiled. "Neither should you." Mara's face tightened. "What did you find?" He could have lied. Instead, he laughed. It was a strange sound, low and almost breathless. Mara stared at him. "Why are you laughing?" Because suddenly Elias understood. She wasn't angry. She wasn't disappointed. She was genuinely scared. The realization changed everything. Until that moment, Elias had believed their secret relationship was the most dangerous thing between them. Now he understood that the relationship had merely opened a door. Behind it was something older, something buried, something involving a dead inmate whose death might not have been natural after all. Mara stepped closer. "Give me the file." Elias shook his head. "You know what happened to Rourke?" "I know enough." "Then tell me." Mara's voice hardened. "Elias, this is not a game." "No," he said quietly. "I don't think it is." She reached toward him, then stopped herself. That hesitation told him more than any confession could have. He held her gaze. "Who else knows?" Mara said nothing. "Was Rourke the first?" Still nothing. Elias's smile returned. Mara's expression changed immediately. "Tell me what you saw." He stepped backward. "You first." "Elias." "No." He turned away, carrying the file with him. Behind him, Mara remained motionless in the corridor. For the first time, Elias was no longer wondering what secret she was hiding. He was wondering how many people had disappeared because of it. And before sunrise, he intended to find out. The next morning, Elias began writing. He found a small notebook and tore away its cover, leaving nothing that could identify it. Every page became a record of something Mara had done. A changed schedule, a missing report, an unexplained transfer, a conversation that ended whenever Elias mentioned Caleb Rourke. At first, the notes were practical. Elias wanted protection. If Mara tried to deny their relationship or punish him, he wanted evidence that could keep her from controlling the story. But fear slowly became something else. The more Elias documented, the more he wanted. He began recording dates, names, locations, and fragments of conversations. He memorized which officers entered Mara's office and how long they stayed. He watched cameras. He counted footsteps. He studied prison routines until ordinary movements started looking suspicious. Then he began connecting things that might not have been connected at all. An officer who once spoke with Mara transferred to another facility. A medical worker resigned after asking questions about Rourke. A report disappeared. Elias wrote everything down. Soon, the notebook was no longer just protection. It was revenge. He imagined Mara standing before investigators, stripped of her authority. He imagined officers turning against her. He imagined reporters discovering the truth and watching her carefully constructed reputation collapse in public. The fantasy gave him a strange satisfaction, but it also changed him. Elias stopped sleeping properly. He began waking at every sound outside his cell. If an officer paused near his door, he assumed Mara had sent him. If another inmate asked a harmless question, Elias wondered whether he was testing him. Even silence became suspicious. One evening, Darren found him sitting alone, staring at several pages spread across his bunk. "You're going too far." Elias didn't look up. "You've said that before. And you're worse now." Elias continued writing. Darren stepped closer. "You're seeing enemies everywhere. Maybe there are enemies everywhere. That's what obsession does." Elias finally looked at him. "You don't understand." "I understand enough." Darren pointed toward the notebook. "You're collecting information, but you're not deciding what's real anymore." Elias closed the notebook. "I know exactly what's real. Do you?" The question hung between them. Darren lowered his voice. "You think exposing her will fix everything. It won't. And if she realizes how much you know, she won't wait for you to expose her." Elias smiled. "She won't hurt me." Darren stared at him. "Why?" Elias leaned back against the wall. "Because he believed the secret gave him power. Because he believed Mara needed him. Because he had mistaken fear for dependence." He finally answered. She needs me more than I need her. Darren said nothing. That silence should have warned him. Instead, Elias interpreted it as proof that he was right. Later that night, he hid the notebook beneath a loose section of his bunk and returned to his routine. But something had changed. For the first time, Elias was no longer simply documenting Mara's secrets. He was challenging her. And challenges inside prison rarely remained private for long. The following morning, Elias discovered that someone had searched his cell. Nothing appeared missing. His clothes were folded exactly as before. His mattress was untouched. The loose section beneath his bunk looked undisturbed. But Elias knew. Someone had been there. He reached beneath the bunk and felt the notebook. It was still there. Then he opened it. One page had been turned. Only one. Across the bottom, beneath everything he had written, someone had added a single sentence. Stop looking for Rourke. Elias stared at the words until his hands began to shake. For the first time, he understood that someone else had been watching him all along. He read the sentence again. It was not a threat. It was worse. It was proof that his private investigation was no longer private, and that whoever knew about it had access to his cell. The sentence stayed in Elias's mind long after the lights went out. Stop looking for Rourke. He had spent the night wondering who could have entered his cell, who had known about the notebook, and how much they had read. By morning, the feeling spreading through the prison mattered more. People were watching him. It started subtly. Conversations stopped when he entered the dining hall. Inmates who normally ignored him suddenly looked twice. An officer lingered near his unit longer than necessary. Then the whispers began. Elias has something on the warden. Nobody knew what it was. Some believed it involved stolen information. Others guessed Mara had given Elias special privileges. A few suggested the relationship between them was more personal than anyone realized. Rumors did not need facts. They only needed fear. Mara understood that better than anyone. By the end of the week, she had begun pulling away from Elias completely. The private conversations stopped. The unexplained favors disappeared. His schedule changed without explanation, and 2 privileges he had previously enjoyed were revoked. When Elias requested an explanation, the officer delivering the decision gave him none. Administrative review. Mara was building distance between them. But distance was not the same as safety. Behind closed doors, she began asking questions. Who had access to Elias's cell? Who had seen the records? Who knew about Rourke? Had Elias told anyone? She asked carefully, never mentioning their secret directly. Her questions were disguised as routine security concerns, but the people answering her could see the urgency underneath. Mara was searching for evidence. More importantly, she was searching for whoever might already possess it. Elias recognized the change. He had expected anger. He had expected threats. He had not expected silence. Mara was acting as if their relationship had never existed. That frightened him. One afternoon, Elias returned to his cell and found another folded piece of paper beneath his mattress. He stood completely still. The room was empty. His hands felt cold as he unfolded it. There were 4 words. You weren't the first. Elias read them twice. Then again. The meaning reached him in pieces. If he had not been the first, then who had come before him? And what had happened to them? His thoughts returned to Caleb Rourke. Then to the missing reports. Then to the strange pattern Darren had warned him about. Suddenly, another possibility emerged. Perhaps Elias had misunderstood everything. Maybe Mara had not discovered him by accident. Maybe she had chosen him. The conversations, the attention, the private meetings, the way she had made him feel understood. What if none of it had been spontaneous? What if someone had wanted Elias close to Mara? Or worse, what if Mara herself had selected him because she knew exactly what kind of person he was? A man who listened. A man who noticed details. A man who could be manipulated by the promise of being trusted. Elias stood there and looked toward the small mirror above the sink. For the first time, he wondered whether he had been investigating Mara because he wanted answers, or because someone had taught him where to look. That thought followed him into the night. Across the prison, Mara sat alone in her office, staring at an old personnel file. She opened it slowly. Inside was a photograph of another inmate. The name beneath it was one Elias had never seen. Mara looked at the photograph for several seconds before whispering, "Not again." And somewhere beyond her office door, footsteps approached, carrying a message that would make the mystery even darker. The footsteps outside Mara's office belonged to someone who had no reason to know what was waiting inside. Detective Lena Hart had been asking questions for 18 months. She had learned that prison deaths were rarely simple. Sometimes an inmate died because his body failed. Sometimes violence found a quiet place to hide. And sometimes paperwork became more important than the person who had disappeared. Caleb Rourke's death had bothered her from the beginning. The official report said he suffered a sudden medical emergency. The conclusion was clean, convenient. Lena had never believed it. She remembered the surveillance footage that vanished from the relevant corridor. She remembered one officer saying Rourke had been calm, while another insisted he had been agitated for hours. She remembered a medical request appearing in the log after his death, as though someone had tried to correct a record too late. None of those details proved murder. Together, they made Lena uncomfortable. Then the case had stalled. Witnesses stopped returning calls. Records became harder to obtain. Staff members suddenly became unavailable. Eventually, the investigation was closed without giving Lena the answer she wanted. But she never stopped remembering Rourke's name. Months later, Elias Voss appeared in a separate report. At first, he seemed irrelevant. A difficult inmate, intelligent, frequently sarcastic, occasionally cooperative when cooperation served his interests. Then Lena noticed the disciplinary records. Elias had been moved between units more often than necessary. His privileges had changed repeatedly. Several reports mentioned unusual interactions with Warden Maravale. That name made Lena stop reading. She requested older records. The pattern emerged slowly. An inmate who had become unusually close to Mara had been transferred. Another had received disciplinary action after questioning prison procedures. A third had abruptly stopped cooperating with an investigation. Then there was Rourke. Lena spread the files across her desk. For names, for stories, different circumstances, the same woman appearing in the background. She did not assume guilt. Patterns could be misleading, but they were often where investigators found questions nobody wanted asked. She returned to Elias's file. There was something different about him. Unlike the others, Elias had not simply disappeared from the system. He was still there, still watching, still asking questions. Lena requested his recent communications, disciplinary notes, and movement history. What she found made her uneasy. Elias had become increasingly paranoid. He had reported unexplained searches. He had complained about missing paperwork. He had repeatedly mentioned Rourke without understanding why the name mattered to investigators. Then Lena found one sentence in a staff report. Inmate appears convinced that administrative personnel are monitoring him. Lena leaned back. That could have meant anything. But another report contained a different observation. Inmate has become unusually concerned with previous deaths. She read the sentence again. Then she opened Rourke's file. She compared dates very carefully again. Elias had begun asking questions shortly before his access restrictions increased. Mara had begun distancing herself from him shortly before those restrictions. And someone had apparently warned Elias to stop looking. Lena stared at the screen. She had spent 18 months wondering whether Rourke had been the beginning of something. Now she wondered whether he had been part of something much larger. Her phone rang. Prison administrator was calling. Lena answered. "I need to speak with you about Elias Voss." There was a pause. Then the administrator said, "Detective, you should probably leave that inmate alone." "Why?" Another pause. "Because people who get involved with him tend to regret it." The line went dead. Lena slowly placed the phone on her desk. It was not the warning itself that concerned her. It was the fear behind it. She looked again at Elias's photograph. For the first time, she stopped seeing him as another inmate in another file. He might be a witness. He might be a suspect. Or he might be the next person in a pattern that had already claimed someone before him. And if Lena was right, the clock had already started. And if Lena was right, the clock had already started. By the time night fell, Elias felt it too. The prison seemed smaller than usual. Every corridor looked narrower. Every locked door sounded louder. He could feel eyes following him whenever he moved. Darren found him near the laundry area shortly after evening count. "You look terrible," Darren said. Elias gave him a tired smile. "I've had better weeks." Darren lowered his voice. "Did you get another message?" "No." "Then why are you acting like someone is coming?" "Because someone is." Darren studied him. Elias reached inside his shirt and touched a folded piece of paper. "I moved everything. Everything. The notes. Copies of the reports. Names. Dates. All of it." "Where?" Elias shook his head. "Somewhere Mara can't find it." Darren's expression hardened. "You need to tell someone." "I already did." "Who?" "Someone outside." Darren stared at him. Elias continued quietly. "If something happens to me, everything gets released." "Are you sure?" "No." The answer frightened Darren more than confidence would have. "You should get protection." "From who?" Darren looked around the corridor. Elias smiled bitterly. "Exactly. That night Mara came to his cell. She did not bring an officer. She came alone. When the door opened, Elias remained seated. "You shouldn't be here," he said. "Neither should you." Her voice was controlled, but her eyes were not. Elias noticed the exhaustion beneath them. "You've been following me. I've been trying to protect you." He laughed softly. "That's what you call it?" Mara stepped closer. "I gave you everything I could. You gave me privileges. I gave you trust. You gave me access." Her face tightened. "You destroyed the only relationship where I ever felt understood." Elias looked at her for a long moment. "No, Mara. You destroyed it when you decided understanding meant control. That isn't fair. Neither is dying for someone else's secret." She went silent. Elias stood. "What happened to Rourke?" "I can't talk about that." "Why?" "Because you don't understand what you're involved in." "Then explain it." Mara's eyes filled with anger. "You think this is a game. You think exposing me will make you powerful. I think the truth belongs to everyone. You don't want truth." Her voice cracked. "You want revenge." Elias did not deny it. Mara looked away. For a moment, she seemed less like a warden and more like the lonely woman he had once known. "I loved you," she whispered. Elias's expression softened, but only briefly. "You loved the version of me you could control." Mara looked back at him. "And you never loved me?" Elias hesitated. "I cared about you." "That isn't the same thing." "No." The silence between them became unbearable. Mara stepped toward the door. "Whatever you think you know, stop digging." Elias watched her leave. "I'm not stopping," he said. The door closed. Neither of them knew it would be the last time they spoke. Hours later, during the early morning count, an officer found Elias inside his cell. He was dead. The prison reacted quickly. Too quickly. The official explanation began forming almost immediately. Suicide. The area was secured. Staff members were questioned. Administrators were notified. By sunrise, the first version of the story was already circulating. Staff spoke in low voices, repeating details nobody had officially confirmed. One officer said Elias had been alone for hours. Another insisted he had shown no unusual behavior. The contradictions were small, but Lena had learned that small contradictions often became the largest doors when nobody wanted the answers. Elias Voss had been unstable. He had become paranoid. He had threatened to expose people. He had finally broken. Detective Lena Hart arrived before the body was removed. She entered the cell slowly. Nothing appeared disturbed. The bed was made. His belongings were arranged neatly. There was no obvious struggle. No overturned furniture. No scattered papers. No sign of panic. Lena stood in silence. Something about the scene bothered her. She had seen suicides before. They were rarely this clean. She looked toward the doorway, then back at Elias. Her eyes narrowed. Who cleaned this cell? No one answered, and that silence told her the investigation had just changed. The silence in the cell told Lena what the official explanation could not. Something was wrong. She began with the simplest question. When was Elias actually alive? The prison's official timeline placed his death sometime after midnight. But witnesses complicated that version almost immediately. A kitchen worker remembered seeing Elias near the service corridor later than recorded. An inmate from the neighboring unit claimed he heard Elias arguing with someone after lights out. Another prisoner remembered footsteps stopping outside Elias's cell shortly before the morning count. None of them knew what those details meant. Lena did. She built a timeline on the wall of the interview room, marking every confirmed sighting with a blue line and every uncertain statement with a red one. The lines refused to match. Then she examined the surveillance system. Several cameras had gaps, not random technical failures. The missing footage clustered around the same period when Elias was supposedly alone. Lena called the security supervisor. Why is this missing? He checked the system twice. Maintenance issue. Who authorized it? I don't know. You should. He looked uncomfortable. That answer was enough. Next came the movement logs. One entry showed Elias remaining inside his unit for the entire relevant period. Another record placed an unidentified staff member near the restricted corridor. Lena compared timestamps. The two records could not both be accurate. Someone had changed something. She requested the original log. The supervisor hesitated. That hesitation became evidence of its own. Detective, he said quietly. Some records are corrected after the fact. By whom? He looked toward the door. Administration. Lena thought of Mara. Then she searched for the evidence Elias had told Darren he had hidden. Nothing. His cell contained no notebook, no copies of reports, no photographs, no names, no hidden storage device. Whatever Elias had collected was gone. Lena returned to the interview room and placed Mara's file on the table. The warden entered without an attorney. She sat straight, hands folded, expression calm. You knew Elias Voss, Lena said. Of course. He was an inmate under my authority. How often did you speak privately? Not often. Did you ever meet him outside official procedures? No. Lena watched her carefully. Did your relationship ever become personal? Mara's expression did not change. No. You're certain? Yes. Elias told someone otherwise. Elias was manipulative. So you deny everything? I deny having an inappropriate relationship with him. The answer was precise. Too precise. Lena leaned back. You knew Caleb Rourke. Mara paused for less than a second. I knew many inmates. Rourke was one of them. Yes. Were you involved in his medical review? No. Did you authorize access restrictions on his file? Mara looked directly at her. I don't remember. Lena opened another folder. You signed the authorization. Mara's eyes remained steady. I signed hundreds of documents. Lena reached into her case and removed a photograph. She placed it face down between them. Mara watched her hand. Do you recognize this? I don't know what it is. Lena turned the photograph over. The image showed Caleb Rourke being escorted through a corridor. Beside him stood Mara. But that was not what made Mara's expression change. In the background was another person. A person whose presence contradicted the official record of Rourke's final night. Mara stared at the photograph. For the first time, her breathing changed. Her fingers tightened against the table. Lena said nothing. She let the silence work. Finally, Mara whispered, Where did you get that? Lena leaned forward. That isn't the question. Mara looked at the photograph again. Then she looked at Lena. The careful mask was gone. And Lena finally knew she had found the thread connecting Elias's death to the one case she had never been able to forget. She had come expecting another denial. Instead, Mara had just revealed something more valuable. She was afraid of what the photograph could prove. The truth survived, but Elias did not. That was the sentence Lena wrote at the top of her case notes. She had spent 2 days searching for the missing evidence, convinced that whoever entered Elias's cell had taken everything. Then an envelope arrived at the police station. There was no return address. Inside was a photograph, a handwritten page, and a small key. "You are looking in the wrong places." Lena recognized Elias's handwriting. She returned to the prison. The key opened a storage compartment in an abandoned maintenance room. Inside, she found several sealed envelopes, each marked with a different name. Elias had prepared for his death. He had not trusted one person with everything. He had divided his evidence between people who barely knew one another, locations no one would normally search, and instructions designed to make the pieces appear meaningless until assembled. His paranoia had not been random. It had been preparation. The first envelope contained copies of altered medical records. The second contained names and dates. The third held photographs showing staff members entering restricted areas on nights when inmates later died. But the fourth envelope changed the investigation. It contained a handwritten statement describing an arrangement between prison officials and medical personnel. Certain incidents were to be classified as accidents or natural deaths. Certain complaints were to disappear. Certain records were to be corrected before outside investigators could examine them. Elias had written one sentence beneath the documents. "They don't need to kill everyone. They only need to make sure nobody believes the survivors." Then she found something else. A recording. Elias's voice came through the damaged device, quieter than usual. "If you're hearing this, Mara probably told you I was dangerous. She won't be completely wrong." Lena stopped the recording. For the first time, she understood that the evidence was not going to make Elias a hero. The remaining files proved that he had manipulated people. He had deliberately encouraged Mara's dependence. He had exaggerated his affection when it benefited him. He had provoked her during arguments because he wanted her frightened and unstable. He had even planted certain questions where he knew they would eventually reach investigators. Elias had not simply stumbled onto the truth. He had hunted it. And once he discovered that Mara was vulnerable, he used that vulnerability. Lena continued listening. "I knew she would protect herself before she protected anyone else," Elias said. "So I made her believe she needed me. I wanted her exposed." His voice became colder. "I wanted her to lose everything." For months, Elias had believed he was the person pulling the strings. But the more she reconstructed his final weeks, the clearer it became that he had been trapped inside the same obsession he was trying to exploit. He wanted justice. Then he wanted revenge. Eventually, he could no longer tell the difference. Darren's warnings suddenly made sense. Elias had not ignored them because he was fearless. He ignored them because he believed he was smarter than everyone around him. That belief had become his weakness. Inside was a list of names, including Mara, several prison officials, 2 medical employees, and one person Lena did not recognize. At the bottom, Elias had written, "If I disappear, start with the person who never needed to ask where I kept the evidence." Someone had anticipated where Elias would hide things. Someone had understood his system, and that meant the person responsible for his death might have been closer than anyone realized. Lena gathered the evidence and returned to her office. She looked at Elias's photograph for a long time. He was not innocent. He had lied. He had manipulated. He had frightened people and used their weaknesses against them. But none of that erased what had been done to him. The truth had survived because Elias had been willing to risk everything to preserve it. The cost was his life. And Lena now understood the tragedy more clearly than ever. Elias had spent his final days trying to control the truth. In the end, the truth was the only thing he could not control. It had survived him. Now Lena had to find the person who had made sure he did not. The person Lena needed to find was closer than anyone realized. Within 48 hours, the investigation changed the prison forever. The evidence Elias had scattered began reaching investigators from different directions. A former officer came forward with copies of reports he had hidden for years. A medical employee admitted that records connected to Caleb Rourke had been altered. Another witness described private meetings between Mara and officials who had insisted Rourke's death required no further investigation. Piece by piece, the silence broke. Mara's reputation collapsed almost as quickly as it had been built. She was suspended pending investigation, then taken into custody for questioning. Charges followed as investigators connected her to the suppression of evidence surrounding earlier deaths and to the circumstances surrounding Elias's final night. Still, Lena refused to call it a victory. The reopened Rourke investigation revealed deliberate omissions. Witnesses who had refused to speak now told investigators what they remembered. Some admitted they had been afraid. Others admitted they had accepted favors to remain quiet. The prison became a place where old secrets finally had nowhere left to hide. Yet Lena kept returning to one question. Did Elias know he was going to die? She reviewed his final recordings repeatedly. His warnings sounded deliberate. His hidden evidence suggested preparation. His statement to Darren suggested that he expected danger. But there was another possibility. Perhaps Elias had believed he could control Mara until the very end. Perhaps he had seen her fear and mistaken it for weakness. Perhaps he had convinced himself that because he understood her, he could predict what she would do. That uncertainty troubled Lena more than any missing document. Elias had spent his final days believing he had discovered Mara's greatest weakness, the truth. And suddenly, Lena remembered the first time she had heard about his strange reaction to her. He had laughed. Not because the situation was funny. Not because he was fearless. He had laughed because, for one brief moment, he believed he had finally found something Mara could never control. The truth. That laughter had sounded reckless at the time. Now it sounded tragic. Elias had believed knowledge would protect him. Instead, knowledge made him dangerous, and being dangerous made him vulnerable. He had wanted justice. He had wanted revenge. He had wanted to watch Mara lose the power she had used against others. But in the end, he lost something far more valuable. His life. Months later, the prison continued operating behind its concrete walls. Doors still locked. Guards still walked the corridors. New inmates arrived, and old ones disappeared into the system. But one corridor remained strangely quiet. It was the same corridor where Elias had once stood beneath humming fluorescent lights, holding secrets he believed would change everything. Lena walked through it alone one night. She stopped outside his former cell. The door was closed. There was no laughter now. Only the distant sound of footsteps fading into darkness. Lena thought about Elias, Mara, Rourke, and all the people who had stayed silent until silence became impossible. Power had controlled the prison for years. It had controlled records, reputations, and fear. But it had never completely controlled the truth. Because truth could be hidden, could be delayed, could even be buried. But sometimes all it needed was one person willing to leave a trail behind. Elias had left that trail, and long after his voice was gone, it was still leading someone toward the truth. The lights hummed overhead, carrying echoes through the empty prison corridor long after midnight again. The corridor emptied, and somewhere beyond the locked doors, another night began. Power can silence a person, but it cannot always silence what they leave behind.